Who slideshow at the top?
Oh yeah, of course, that's it. Okay, so in my presentation, I want to bring to your attention the texts The Winter's Tale by William Shakespeare and Michaelmas Term by Thomas Middleton. And the overarching theme that I'd like to focus on is the theme of women, sex and marriage. Contextually, both the texts were written in the early 1600s, specifically 1605 for Michaelmas Term and for The Winter's Tale 1611. Thomas Middleton was one of the playwrights of the Jacobean period whose talent may not have been as recognised as his contemporaries perhaps, but he had a very long career in the professional theatre from 1601, and he was employed by the City of London in the arranging of pageants, and he was also appointed as the city chronologer in 1620. A large portion of his work was published without the correct mention of his name. This was the case with Michaelmas Term and the Revengers tragedy. This makes it quite difficult for the finding of original documents and images of his work of the time, but nevertheless there are some out there. Middleton used his experiences of London, I think, as the stem which fueled his sort of visions and which he portrayed in his writing. And in some of his texts there's quite a grim view of the world, and it's reflected a lot in his earlier plays, but not so much in the sort of middle period and his final works, where his plots become more complicated and not so focused on like real life issues, I suppose. His view of women, sex and marriage perhaps is also fueled by his life in London, where some women worked as prostitutes or didn't have a respectable lifestyle because they had to make ends meet. In Michaelmas Term, there are certain specific issues which he reveals through conversations between different characters, and the details of each of these conversations, which I'll talk about later in the presentation, they amount to an overarching impression of women's sex and marriage norms at the time. First of all, this is the scene I'd like to discuss from Michaelmas Term, which I think aids the discussion of women and particularly marriage. The characters of Leith and Helgill in Act 2, Scene 1 talk about Helgill's new female acquaintance, and I think this piece reflects a lot of what they think about her status, her social class, and also her sexuality. He comments on her physical side, describing her as young and beautiful, and that she is a maid, although Leith's comment is that he prefers older women, which may not be maids, but they allow for adultery in a way. And I think that's quite important because it highlights that that was one of the approaches to marriage, I think, in society at the time. Men didn't necessarily have to be faithful or loyal because there was a very large and readily available sector of society which made money through sex, like prostitutes basically. Men also made use of these services, obviously, and there wasn't the same understanding of hygiene and health that we have now. And Helgill says, diseases gnaw at thy bones, which perhaps reflects, which in this context alludes to the possibility that he suffers from some sexually transmitted diseases, perhaps such as syphilis, which actually directly affects bone marrow in the body. So this entire conversation brings forward certain notions about sex and marriage which were considered normal at the time. The fact that this young woman is described as being a gentlewoman of a great house, I think highlights certain elements of her social status, because if she was of a lower class, she would have been probably referred to as a wench, because there's lots of examples in the text where they say wenching and they call women whores, and they're not really described the way that this one was described. When Helgill comments that this woman qualifies more as a wife than a maid, he perhaps is suggesting that she's no longer a virgin, which it doesn't say whether she is or she isn't, but he follows on to say that he wants to be the godfather of her firstborn child, and that will give him, he thinks, more power and authority over her. And in the notes on page 95 of the text, it suggests that what he means by this is that other men will be able to enjoy her beauty, but only he will have power and possession over her body. There is also some reference to gay relationships and intimacy between men in this text, although the majority of the sexual puns and comments are interpreted as heterosexual. In scene 1, act 1, there is a conversation between the characters Easy and Salewood. They're talking about a house, but Easy says, "The house not only endued with a new-fashioned four-part, but, which is more convenient for a gentleman, with a very provident back door." Now, in the notes on page 73, it suggests that this does have sexual connotations, which reveals that although men were largely preoccupied with discussing the sexual availability of women, they also had more liberal sexual views. This notion is fortified by several conversations that took place between the characters of Shortyard and Quasimodo, who were trying to put Easy into an unfortunate situation by following him and leading him to common vices such as gambling and wenching, which is a term they use quite a lot. In the notes, it does say that it was the norm for it was a norm of sorts for Elizabethan men to sleep with each other as a habit of friendliness. But I think in a lot of cases, when you read into this text, the connotations surpass just friendliness, and it becomes obvious that sex was quite a big part of society, I think, at the time. This is the quote to which I was referring when I said that there were conversations between Shortyard and Quasimodo. I think it highlights the presence and the availability of brothel houses and prostitutes, but also it highlights the fact that promiscuity in the form of prostitution, gambling and excessive drinking were quite normal at the time, almost as a form of entertainment, and that might be why Easy was led into this kind of lifestyle quite easily, I suppose. And the second text which I'd like to talk about, as I said, is going to be The Winter's Tale. Contextually, this play was written towards the end of Shakespeare's career, and it's part of a group of plays which are tragicomedies, and that's what sets them apart from his earlier works, because they have a mainly tragic plotline, but with a very definitive happy ending, if you like. This text was written in 1610 and performed in 1611. It was also performed at 1613 at court, when Princess Elizabeth's betrothal to Elector Palatine was announced, which is a fact I didn't know prior to this. Some critics have said that it was deliberately revised prior to the performance, and also that it was condemned for some of its language and some of the absurdities that occur. It falls into two parts. The first three acts contain the majority of the tragedy itself, and it does reveal quite a happy ending for most of the characters, those who aren't dead from the tragic part of the play. Some critics say that The Winter's Tale is actually dramatically more exciting than even The Tempest, because Shakespeare incorporates a very strong sense of dramatic suspense in this text, and that intensifies the surprise at the end of the play. It only has 15 scenes, but it deals with lots of sometimes religious and sometimes mythological imagery, but the overarching theme and interest of the play is love and marriage. It's about the restoration of love which has been lost, and new life which brings new love into the world also. I think it's also considered by some critics to follow a convention of older medieval miracle plays, which at the end reveal a type of redemption following like a tragic loss or something tragic that's happened to the character. What's that one there? This is the first image I used from Evo. Now, unfortunately, the difficulty I had with using the Evo document was that it was 460 pages, and I couldn't find the specific page which related me to The Winter's Tale. But when I did find the page eventually, it showed an original list of actors, so who would be playing each person in the play, and the original date and where it was played. And the one that I found did note that it was at the court. So I'm yet to find a physical copy of that page, but it does exist. That's a quick plot summary of the play, but I'd actually prefer to move on to some of the puns, which are to do with sex in the play, and they are quite humorous actually, despite it being like a serious play in the middle. Most of these puns come from the character of Leontes, or Leonte, sorry about my pronunciation. But the Elizabethan audience might have considered his outbursts to be a reflection of his demonic possession, because what happens in the play is that he gets extremely pathologically jealous of his wife. He assumes and suspects that she has cheated on him with his friend, although she has not. And she's also pregnant with his child, but he believes it to be someone else's. So it's a sort of jealousy which turns not just into a mental problem for him, but also it surrounds everything he does. It affects everything he does, rather. It becomes an illness and a type of madness. And I think that that's something that's very cleverly reflected. I think Shakespeare shows the sort of emotional turmoils that men can go through sometimes very, very well. And particularly because it's a married couple that he's describing, I think it's interesting to see that aspect, because I think stereotypically women are often presented as the jealous or overprotective or obsessive creatures by nature, but in fact it's very often the other way around. I think this describes it very well. So this is from, this quote is from scene 2, and this, excuse me, he says the word play quite a few times in this scene, and the first mention of the word in this particular extract is used in a straightforward sense. But like if you paraphrase what he has said, he's saying to the boy, "Go and play while your mother pretends to be a good hostess, but I think she is a player of a different game, which has sexual connotations." And he carries on to say, "And I am going to play her," which basically means that him and the mother of this boy have a sexual relationship. The word disgraced in this instance could mean shameful, and the word issue could mean a result, which perhaps is related to the fact that he thinks she is carrying a bastard child. The word disgraced could also have a larger overarching meaning throughout the play, because in a way, this character, Leontes, he is without the grace of God due to his singing against Hermione, his wife, because he betrays her and publicly accuses her of infidelity, although deep down he knows that she is guiltless.
Chris, you have time.
Oh, okay, that's fine. This is a quote which shows that Leontes' jealousy and madness has reached a certain point of no return, and it also shows her patience and her willing to wait for her husband to recover and realise that he's wrong. The last slide I've got is just a critical perspective that I found to do with the main protagonist and the emotional turmoil which he's experiencing, and it compares him to Othello. And my conclusion is very short. I just want to say that the male characters in the two texts display an animal-like desire to control and manipulate women, and in Michaelmas Term, the men freely discuss their interest in prostitutes and discuss the physical elements such as virginity and age in relation to women. And in The Winter's Tale, we see a more psychological state of control when the wife is publicly humiliated by her own husband. So I think both texts highlight the significance of the theme of women, sex and marriage of the time.
Thank you. Okay. Do you think there's an interesting distinction between these two plays that I'm interested to hear what you have to say about? Michaelmas Term is a city comedy and is quite clearly rooted in its own moment, isn't it? In the kind of early Jacobean London.
Yeah.
Winter's Tale is set in this kind of virtually mythical realm of Bohemia. And so how can you kind of bring those two very disparate plays together?
Well, initially I thought that was a difference that I couldn't bring together. And initially I thought the same. I was like, oh, how on earth are they similar? But actually I thought that they, in the way that they represent married life, or at least the approach to marriage, I thought that made them very similar, because in The Winter's Tale, in the lead up to Leontes accusing his wife of having committed adultery, the way he describes her in really sometimes kind of aggressive, like sexually crude language, it's actually quite similar to the way that in Michaelmas Term the woman is described, and it's like just the physical appearance that they focus on, like making her seem like a whore when she isn't, basically, I think.
Okay. And is the genre thing significant? You did mention that Winter's Tale is a tragic comedy, and obviously Michaelmas Term is a comedy per se.
Yeah.
Do you think that's got a bearing on the treatment of the topic?
I think to a certain extent it is, because I don't think at the time there were any plays or texts that approached marriage like with a seriousness or a sobriety, really. It was satirised a lot of the time on stage, and that was normal. It kind of still is. I think that's an approach that they had to acquire in order to sort of reach out to the audience, I suppose. If you make something a comedy, regardless of whether people understand the depth behind it, it's still going to sink in. And so a lot of the points they make about marriage